The silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence in itself, a cold weight that pressed against the bulkheads of the Stellacede. It was the sterile quiet of a laboratory, layered over the profound, endless hush of the void. Dr. Eris Thorne sat strapped in the observation chair, her world confined to the soft, green glow of the holographic displays that bloomed around her like spectral flora. Her breath was the only rhythm in the cabin, a slow, metronomic counterpoint to the silent dance of cosmic dust outside the viewport. Before her, hanging in the black like a shard of frozen music, was the target a choral harmonizer. It wasn't a ship in any human sense of the word. It was a cathedral of living crystal, kilometers long, its crystalline facets pulsing with a soft, internal luminescence that shifted from violet to a pale, cold blue. It sang a song that couldn't be heard with ears, but could be felt in the bones, a resonant frequency of perfect, absolute order that vibrated through the very fabric of space-time. The coral didn't conquer. They assimilated. They were a geologic consciousness, a crystalline hive mind that saw the chaotic, messy, carbon-based life of the galaxy not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a discordant note to be corrected, a flaw to be harmonized into the silent perfection of their own being. Eris watched the harmonizer, her face a placid mask that betrayed none of the fury coiling in her gut. She had once dedicated her life to understanding and cultivating life in its most diverse and beautiful forms. On Ethel, she had walked through forests of luminous fungi and cataloged flora that communicated through intricate biochemical signals. She had known the chaotic, unpredictable, glorious symphony of a living world. Now, she cultivated only one thing a blight, a dissonance, a single screaming note of pure biological chaos designed to shatter their perfect song. She unstrapped herself and moved through the cramped corridor that led from the cockpit to the ship's heart, the Chrysalis Bay. The Stellacede was a repurposed xenobotanical surveyor, its holds once filled with seed banks and soil samples, its labs designed for genetic sequencing and propagation. Now, they served a different purpose. The air in the bay was thick with the smell of damp earth, ozone, and something else. Something faintly sweet and deeply unsettling. Inside a triple-sealed containment field, it grew Cordyceps exilium, the exile fungus. It was her life's work, her masterpiece, her sin. It glowed with a sickly yellow-green light, its mycelial network spreading across a nutrient bed of processed asteroid substrate in intricate, fractal patterns that seemed to mock the rigid geometry of the coral. She had engineered it from 1,000 different samples, splicing genes from extremophilic bacteria that could survive hard vacuum, deep-sea fungi that thrived on sulfuric vents, and a particularly virulent strain of Terran cordyceps that hijacked the nervous systems of insects, turning them into mindless puppets. Her version did something similar, but instead of hijacking a nervous system, it targeted resonant crystal. Once it found a host, it didn't kill it. It burrowed into the crystalline lattice, and as it grew, it screamed. Not a sound, but a chaotic cascade of bioelectric signals, a feedback loop of random, discordant frequencies that was pure anathema to the coral's hive mind. It was the biological equivalent of static, a weapon that didn't destroy, but instead drove a piece of the perfect whole irrevocably, hopelessly insane. Her hands, encased in sterilized gauntlets, moved with the practiced, steady grace of a surgeon. She selected the most virulent culture, a pulsating mass of filaments that seemed to recoil from the light. Using remote manipulators, she loaded the sample into a delivery pod, a small, stealth-coated drone that looked more like a blackened seed than a weapon of war. There was no explosive payload, no warhead. The pod's only function was to breach the harmonizer's crystalline hull and introduce its single, precious passenger. She remembered Ethel's song. It had been a complex harmony of wind through the gossamer trees, the chittering of arboreal creatures, the low thrum of the planetary magnetosphere, and beneath it all, the quiet hum of the research outpost, of generators and air recyclers, and the soft murmur of her team, her family. She remembered Elias, his hands perpetually stained with soil, his laugh a warm, rumbling bass note in the melody of her life. He was mapping the root system of a psilocybin forest the day the coral arrived. Their arrival wasn't an invasion, it was a change in the weather. The sky, a soft, dusty rose, began to shimmer with prismatic light. The air grew still, and a low, beautiful hum descended upon the world. At first, it was hypnotic, calming. The team had gathered outside, watching in awe as the landscape began to transform. The leaves on the gossamer trees slowly developed a crystalline sheen. The vibrant red soil hardened into amethyst. It was beautiful, Elias had whispered, his eyes wide with a scientist's wonder. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Then the hum deepened, its frequency shifting from a soothing tone to something that vibrated deep within their cells. The wonder on their faces turned to confusion, then to pain. Eris, shielded inside a deep earth geological lab, could only watch on her monitors as the crystallization accelerated. She saw Elias reach for her, his hand outstretched before his skin began to glitter, his form slowly, inexorably, turning into a statue of flawless, silent crystal, his expression of love and terror frozen for eternity. The song of Ethel had been silenced, replaced by the single, perfect, monotonous note of the choral. Eris had been the only survivor, the only discordant note left in a world that had been harmonized. She had escaped on the Stellacid with the planet's entire bioarchive, a library of silent symphonies, and a cold, clear purpose. She would not let their song be forgotten. She would make the choral hear it. Back in the cockpit, Eris guided the seed pod through the void. The choral didn't use conventional sensors. They detected threats by listening for interruptions in their song, for the loud, violent energies of weapons fire or engine signatures. The pod was silent, cold, and dark. To them, it was just another piece of stellar debris, a speck of chaotic matter that hadn't yet been harmonized. It latched onto the harmonizer's hull with a magnetic clamp so faint it was barely a whisper on her own sensors. For a long moment, nothing happened. The pod activated its micro-laser drill, boring a hole no wider than a needle through the crystalline armor. It was a slow, patient process. Eris didn't watch the pod. She watched her frequency monitors. The display showed the coral's resonance as a perfect, unwavering sine wave of pure blue. Then, the pod injected its payload. The blue line on the monitor held steady. 1 minute. 2. Eris held her breath. Had it failed? Had they found a way to neutralize it? Then, a flicker. A tiny, almost imperceptible tremor in the perfect wave. A single pixel of the blue line jumped, turning a sickly yellow. It was a cough. A hiccup in the divine choir. The flicker appeared again, stronger this time, joined by another. The perfect sine wave began to fray at the edges, the pure blue corrupted by threads of chaotic yellow noise. On the main viewer, a section of the harmonizer's hull began to lose its luster. The internal light within that segment flickered erratically, like a dying bulb. The song was breaking. Eris didn't smile. Joy was a feeling that belonged to another lifetime, to a woman who had died on Ethel. What she felt was a grim, quiet satisfaction, the cold contentment of a problem being solved. The coral fleet in the sector reacted, not with alarm, but with profound confusion. She monitored their network, the resonant pulses they used for communication. The other coral vessels were querying the harmonizer, their signals conveying a sense of clinical curiosity. Query structural flaw detected. Query resonant frequency degrading. Analysis internal matrix decay. They couldn't conceive of an external attack. Their philosophy, their very existence, was based on the premise that they were the ultimate state of order. Any flaw, any dissonance, had to be an internal failure, a part of themselves that had somehow forgotten the song. That was their weakness. They could not comprehend a weed in their perfect, sterile garden. The harmonizer began to fracture, not with the violence of an explosion, but with the slow, agonizing grace of a glacier calving. A vast, crystalline spire broke away from the main structure and drifted silently into the void. The light inside the afflicted section was now a pulsing, chaotic strobe of yellow and black. The song emanating from it was no longer music. It was a shriek of raw static, a howl of a billion crystalline structures vibrating out of sync. It was the sound of a mind tearing itself apart. Eris turned the stelliseed away, its drive emitting a low-frequency pulse that mimicked the sonar of a void whale. A colossal, spacefaring beast the coral registered as harmless background fauna. She slipped back into the darkness, leaving the wounded god to scream into the void. She listened to the coral's frantic, confused signals as they tried to quarantine their dying brother. Their perfect harmony now tainted by a growing chorus of static and fear. They didn't know what had hit them. They didn't know that a ghost was hunting them, a ghost reeking of soil and life and rage. Eris brought up a star chart, the holographic display casting her face in its ethereal green light. Her next target was a nexus, a relay point that amplified the coral's song across 3 systems. It was a vital organ. She keyed in the coordinates and initiated the calculations for her next spore culture. She was no longer Dr. Eris Thorne, the xenobotanist who nurtured life. She was the blight, the pestilence, the disease. The coral had sought to create a silent galaxy, a universe of perfect, static harmony. She would give them a galaxy that screamed. The journey to the Nexus Point, designated Relay 734, was a long, silent fall through the skeletal arms of the Orion's Veil. The nebula was a graveyard of dying stars and a nursery for new ones, a vast shadow chaotic canvas of incandescent gas and opaque dust that was the perfect hiding place for a ship designed to be invisible. For 3 weeks, Eris worked, her life pared down to a monastic cycle of system checks, astrogation, and the meticulous cultivation of her next weapon. In the chrysalis bay, she refined the exile fungus, tailoring a new strain for the Nexus. The relay wasn't a living crystalline ship like the Harmonizer. It was a more utilitarian structure, a semi-sentient network of energy conduits and resonance chambers, the brainstem of the coral's song in this sector. Her new culture, which she designated Lethe, was designed not for a violent, cacophonous death, but for a slow, creeping amnesia. It wouldn't make the Nexus scream, it would make it forget the song, introducing subtle corruptions into the data stream, transposing notes, erasing passages, until the perfect harmony broadcast across the sector devolved into a meaningless, senile hum. It was a more subtle, more insidious form of murder. During the long, quiet hours, the ghost of Elias was her constant companion. He wasn't a memory she summoned. He was a phantom limb, an ache in the empty space beside her. She would find herself turning to share a particularly beautiful view of a stellar nursery, the brilliant pinks and blues of nascent suns painting the viewport, only to be met with the cold indifference of the observation chair. In these moments, the weight of her solitude threatened to crush her. She remembered him in the ship's tiny hydroponics bay, where she still grew Terran herbs not for sustenance, but for the scent of living things. He'd once spent an entire evening explaining the intricate symbiotic relationship between a particular orchid and a species of moth on Ethel, his voice filled with a reverence that she had mistaken for simple passion. Now she knew it was a form of worship. He had seen the universe as a sacred, interconnected whole. The coral saw it as a flawed score in need of an editor. She was a corruption in the code, a vengeful god's answer to their sterile prayer. She kept the bioarchive of Ethel running on a low-power loop, the genetic codes of 10,000 extinct species scrolling across a secondary monitor like a silent memorial. It was a litany of the dead, and she was its high priestess. As the Stellacide drew closer to Relay 734, her sensors picked up the coral's response to her first attack. They were adapting. A new class of vessel had appeared, smaller, sleeker ships that moved in sterile, geometric patrols around the relay. They didn't pulse with the vibrant, shifting colors of the harmonizers. They were a flat, matte white, absorbing all light. And they emitted a frequency that made her teeth ache even through the ship's hull dampeners. It was a null field, a cone of weaponized silence. Her frequency monitors, which had shown the background song of the coral as a steady blue wave, depicted the new ships as absolute black lines, holes punched in the fabric of their music. They were purifiers, an immune response. They were designed to detect and sterilize any dissonant frequency, any chaotic energy that didn't belong. Her seed pod, her beautiful, simple weapon, would be detected and vaporized before it got within 1,000 kilometers. The coral couldn't comprehend biology, but they could comprehend a threat to their order. They were learning. Eris pulled the Stellacide into the shadow of a colossal, iron-rich asteroid, a behemoth pockmarked with 1 billion years of impacts, and shut down all non-essential systems. She became a ghost, watching, listening. The purifiers moved in an unalterable, predictable pattern, a perfect, overlapping grid of silence that left no corner of the space around the relay unguarded. Her mission, so clear and simple before, was now a complex, perhaps impossible, puzzle. Rage was a fuel, but it couldn't burn through a wall of absolute silence. As she analyzed their patrol routes, a faint, desperate signal flickered across her comms panel. It was human, a standard civilian distress call on a loop, weak and degraded, like a dying breath. Mayday, Mayday. This is the freighter Rust Bucket. Drive core critical. Life support failing. Requesting immediate assistance. Mayday. She triangulated the signal. It was coming from a debris field on the far side of the relay, well within the Purifier's patrol grid. A fool's trajectory, likely taken to avoid a standard coral patrol, only to stumble into the nest of their new guardians. A part of her, the cold, pragmatic core that had been forged in Ethel's ashes, dismissed it instantly. An acceptable loss. Her mission was paramount. The fate of one freighter crew was meaningless against the scale of what she was trying to achieve. She couldn't risk exposure, not for strangers. She watched the debris field through her long-range optical scope. The Rust Bucket was aptly named. It was an old hauler-class vessel, scarred and dented, a trail of frozen coolant glittering in its wake. It was a miracle it was still holding together. Then she saw the Purifier. It detached from the grid, its white or silent form gliding toward the source of the distress call with the unhurried certainty of a predator. The humans on that ship were broadcasting chaos. They were shouting in a library. To the coral, their panicked signal was no different from the scream of her fungus. It was a dissonance that needed to be silenced. Eris's hand hovered over the controls, her knuckles white. Let them die. They were a complication she didn't need. They were noise. But Elias's voice echoed in her mind, from a night spent looking at the stars through Ethel's thin atmosphere. Every single one is a universe. Eris, every life. You can't just write them off as a rounding error. He had been talking about the ethics of planetary terraforming, but the words struck her now with the force of a physical blow. When had she become the thing she was fighting? An entity that weighed lives on a cold, cosmic scale and found them wanting. The coral harmonized life into silent crystal. She was letting it be snuffed out into silent vacuum. The difference was a matter of aesthetics. She cursed, a raw, guttural sound that tore through the sterile quiet of the cockpit. She cursed Elias for his ghost, and she cursed herself for being unable to exercise it. She had a new plan. It was reckless. It was stupid. It was human. She couldn't use the Lethe strain. It was too subtle, too slow. She needed a distraction, something loud and messy. She returned to the chrysalis bay and prepared a different sample. It was one of her earliest experiments. A crude, unstable culture she had named Shrieker. It didn't spread efficiently, and it burned itself out quickly. But for a few brilliant, agonizing minutes, it produced a bioelectric frequency of such pure, chaotic violence that it was the equivalent of a supernova in the coral's placid sensory world. It was a biological flare. She loaded the Shrieker sample into her last remaining seed pod. The new problem was delivery. The Purifier would intercept the pod. So, she wouldn't aim for the relay. She wouldn't even aim for a coral ship. She aimed for the asteroid she was hiding behind. The pod shot out, a silent black speck against a silent black rock. It impacted with a soft thud, its magnetic clamps engaging. The pod drilled into the iron-rich surface and injected the fungus not into a crystalline mind, but into a matrix of conductive metal ore. For a moment, it did nothing. The fungus had no consciousness to hijack, but the asteroid was bathed in the ambient energy of the relay and the nearby stellar nursery. The Shrieker culture, hyper-aggressive and starved for a host, began to do the only thing it knew how: grow and scream. It fed on the raw energy, its mycelial network spreading through the asteroid's metallic veins. It didn't create dissonance. It became a massive, chaotic antenna, amplifying the background radiation of the nebula into a focused, deafening blast of pure static. On her monitors, The blue sine wave of the choral song was instantly swallowed by a tidal wave of jagged, screaming yellow. The effect on the choral was immediate and profound. All three purifiers simultaneously broke formation. Their ordered, geometric patrol dissolved into a frantic, panicked convergence on the screaming rock. The distress signal from the rust bucket was completely ignored. A whisper lost in a hurricane. To the choral, a dying freighter was a nuisance. This asteroid was an existential threat, a cancer of pure chaos that had appeared out of nowhere. Eris watched as the three white ships surrounded the asteroid, their null fields overlapping, trying to smother the chaotic noise. It was a beautiful, terrible sight. She used the diversion, the window of chaos she had created, to act, pushing the Stelliceid's stealth systems to their breaking point. She skirted the edge of the battle, her ship a shadow moving through a storm. She broadcast a single, tight beam message to the rust bucket. Your mayday is a death sentence. Shut down all transmissions and non-essential power. Drift. Now. There was a pause, a flicker of frantic, encrypted chatter from the freighter, and then its distress signal winked out. The ship went dark, becoming just another piece of junk in a field of junk. A ghost. Eris didn't wait for a thank you. She had given them a chance. The rest was up to them. Her focus was back on the relay. With the purifiers distracted, the path was clear. But as she lined up her approach, she saw one of the purifiers do something unexpected. Before fully committing its null field to the asteroid, it launched a small drone. A specimen collector. The drone, shielded against the chaotic frequencies, zipped toward the asteroid, scooped up a chunk of the infected, screaming ore, and returned to the purifier. They had a sample. They were no longer just fighting a ghost. They were taking it back to their lab to dissect it. A cold dread, colder than the void outside, settled in Eris's stomach. She had saved a ship of strangers, but in doing so, she had given the enemy the very weapon she was using against them. The clock was ticking now in a way it hadn't been before. The Coral were methodical, but they were not slow. They would analyze the fungus. They would understand it, and they would engineer a cure. She looked at the now defenseless relay, its intricate crystalline structures glowing softly in the nebula's light. She had to act now, before her blight became nothing more than a momentary, forgotten fever. Her brief, costly act of humanity was over. It was time, once again, to become the monster. The Stellicide drifted toward Relay 734 like a spore on a solar wind, its every system pared down to a whisper. The purifiers were still consumed by the screaming asteroid, their null fields locked in a desperate overlapping embrace as they struggled to contain the bioelectric phantom. It was a siege against a ghost, and Eris was the shadow slipping past the guards. She had one shot. Her primary weapon, the subtle, amnesiac lethe-strain, was now useless. Subtlety was a luxury she could no longer afford. The Coral had a sample of her work. They were already dissecting her soul. She needed to cripple them, to tear out the brainstem of their song in this sector before they could broadcast a cure, an antibody to her existence. In the Chrysalis Bay, she worked with a feverish intensity. She had no more seed pods, no elegant delivery systems. She had only the ship itself. She began converting the main coolant reservoir, a large, shielded tank that ran the length of the ship's spine, into a makeshift sprayer. It was a crude, brutal solution. She would have to get dangerously close, practically scraping the relay's hull, and vent the entire tank of a new, hyper-aggressive culture directly onto its surface. She named it Thanatos. It was a cocktail of her most virulent strains, genetically recoded not just to create dissonance, but to physically devour crystalline structures. It fed on the relay's energy, and its waste product was a highly corrosive enzyme that dissolved the coral's perfect geometry into a slurry of dull, inert silicon. It didn't just make them forget the song, it ate the singers. As she worked, a transmission came through from the rust bucket. It was a tight beam, short-range signal, just a flicker of data, not a voice, but a text string that appeared on her console. They're gone. We're dark. Who are you? Aris stared at the words, her hands frozen above the coolant pump controls. The question was a spear through the armor of her cold resolve. Who was she? A ghost, a monster, a scientist who had weaponized life itself. She was the memory of a dead world, a walking, breathing tombstone. She typed a single word in reply. Ethel. The name was an answer and a warning. It was the reason for her war, and the justification for her sins. The reply from the rust bucket was almost instantaneous. Ethel. We heard. We thought. No survivors. There was a pause, a moment of silent communion across the void. They knew. The story of Ethel was a ghost story whispered in the dark corners of the Outer Rim, a cautionary tale of a world that had gone silent, another colony lost to the relentless, beautiful, terrible advance of the coral. You're the one, the Blight. The name sent a chill through her. So that's what they called her out here. Not a ghost, not a hero, a disease. The freighter's captain, a man who identified himself only as Jax, seemed to understand her silence. We're in your debt. We're low on fuel. Life support is patchy, but our nav computer is intact. The purifiers are still blind. We're making a run for the Kepler Trench. If you make it out of this, there's a place. A shadow port. Whisper your name there. You're not the only one who remembers. The message ended with a set of encrypted coordinates and a final, simple sentence. Give them hell. Then the rust bucket went silent, a ghost slipping away into a deeper darkness. You're not the only one. The words echoed in the sterile quiet of the bay. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of her solitude lifted. Just a fraction. There were others, other ghosts, other memories. The knowledge didn't bring her comfort. It brought focus. Her war was no longer just her own. It was a shared burden. She had to succeed, not just for Elias, but for the scattered, broken remnants of humanity who were still fighting in the shadows. She sealed the coolant tank, now filled with a glowing, viscous slurry of Thanatos, and returned to the cockpit. The approach to the relay was a masterclass in stealth piloting. She used the structure's own energy emissions to mask her own, a moth hiding in the glare of a flame. The relay was a magnificent, terrifying structure, a latticework of crystalline conduits that pulsed with the lifeblood of the coral's song. It was the heart, and she was the dagger. She brought the Stelliseed in low, her ship's hull just meters above the glowing surface. The proximity alarms screamed, but she ignored them. From her viewport, she could see the intricate, fractal patterns carved into the crystal, a language of pure mathematics. It was beautiful, she thought, with a detached, clinical horror. Utterly, perfectly beautiful. And she was about to defile it. She opened the vents. The Thanatos culture, a thick, phosphorescent green, sprayed out in a wide arc, clinging to the crystalline surface like a toxic dew. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The moment the culture touched the relay, the crystal began to corrode. The brilliant internal light of the structure sputtered and died, replaced by the sickly green glow of the fungus. The perfect geometric patterns dissolved into bubbling, pock-marked craters. The song of the relay didn't just stop. It died in a gurgling, strangled gasp. On her monitors, the blue sine wave that represented the coral's song across the entire sector flatlined. It was replaced by nothing. Not static, not chaos. Just a profound, absolute silence. She had done it. She had ripped the tongue from their choir. The silence lasted for precisely 7 seconds. Then, the coral responded. The 3 purifiers abandoned the asteroid instantly. The screaming rock, their all-consuming obsession moments before, was now completely forgotten. Their new imperative was absolute. They turned in perfect unison, their flat white hulls accelerating toward her with a speed she hadn't thought possible. They were no longer guards. They were avengers. At the same moment, the relay, even as it was being eaten from the inside out, began to defend itself. Crystalline shards, some as large as her ship, sheared off from the main structure and shot toward her, not randomly, but guided by the last vestiges of the relay's dying consciousness. They were crystalline antibodies, and she was the infection. Eris slammed the throttle forward, the Stelliceid's engines screaming in protest as she threw the ship into a desperate, evasive spiral. A shard of crystal the size of a shuttlecraft missed her cockpit by inches, its passing shadow a cold caress of death. The purifiers were closing the distance, their null fields reaching for her, preparing to snuff out her ship's energy, her life, her entire existence. She was caught between the dying rage of the relay and the cold, silent fury of its protectors. Her ship was a surveyor, not a warship. It was fast and quiet, but it was fragile. The hull groaned under the strain of the high G maneuvers. A warning light flashed on her console. Structural integrity failure. Port wing. She was bleeding. Then, something new appeared on her long-range sensors. A gravitational anomaly. A tear in space-time, forming just behind the pursuing purifiers. A jump point. But it wasn't hers. From the shimmering distortion, a ship emerged. It was a battered, ugly thing, a patchwork of different technologies. Its hull, a chaotic mosaic of scavenged plates and aftermarket modules. It was a Frankenstein's monster of a vessel, but it moved with the vicious grace of a shark. It was the Rust Bucket. They hadn't run. They had circled back. Before the purifiers could react to the new threat, the freighter's hull split open, revealing a spinal-mounted magnetic accelerator cannon, a piece of repurposed asteroid mining equipment that had no business being on a ship of its size. It fired. The projectile wasn't a missile or a plasma bolt. It was a solid 20-ton chunk of iron ore, launched at a significant fraction of the speed of light. It was a crude, brutal, utterly human weapon. The slug tore through the null field of the lead purifier as if it were tissue paper. The impact was silent, but the result was absolute. The white, perfect ship shattered into 1,000 pieces of glittering, silent debris. The remaining 2 purifiers reacted instantly, turning to face this new, loud, chaotic threat. It was a fatal mistake. They were built to fight ghosts, not brawlers. In their sterile, ordered world, they had no tactical response for a ship that was literally throwing rocks at them. The brief moment of their confusion was all Eris needed. She pushed her damaged ship to its limit, diving into the wreckage of the relay itself. She weaved through the dying, crumbling crystalline arches, using the corroding structure as cover. The rust bucket fired again, its second shot missing its target, but impacting the relay, accelerating its collapse. The entire structure began to implode, a slow, graceful cascade of shattering crystal and dying light. The two remaining purifiers, caught between the freighter's brute force and the relay's death throes, broke formation and jumped, vanishing into the silent black. They had abandoned the field. Aris navigated the Stellacide out of the collapsing graveyard, her port wing trailing a plume of frozen atmosphere. The rust bucket moved to intercept her, its blocky form a reassuringly solid presence in the void. A voice, rough and laced with static, crackled over her comms. It was Jax. "You look like hell." Ethel. Eris let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, a shaky, ragged sound. She looked at the empty space where the relay had been, a void in the song that would echo across the sector. She looked at the approaching freighter, a ship full of strangers who had risked everything for a ghost. "You're late," she said, the words cracking with an emotion she couldn't name. Jax laughed. A raw, ugly, beautiful sound. Fashionably. "Now, let's get you patched up. The war's not over. It's just getting started." Eris watched them approach, her cold, solitary war suddenly, terrifyingly, not so solitary anymore. She had given them silence. Jax and his crew had given her a voice, and, together, they had a chance to turn that voice into a symphony of rebellion. The Shadowport in the Kepler Trench wasn't a station, it was a scar. A hollowed-out asteroid nestled deep within a turbulent accretion disk of ice and rock. Its interior was a chaotic, jury-rigged city of scavenged ship hulls and repurposed cargo containers, all welded together in a gravity-defying, multi-layered sprawl. It was a place of ghosts and whispers, a haven for the scattered, the broken, and the defiant. They called it the Echo Chamber, as the Stellacide, now crudely patched with plates salvaged from the rust bucket's hull, was guided into a docking bay by magnetic grapples. Eris felt a profound sense of dislocation. For years, her world had been the sterile silence of her ship, her only company, the phantom of her dead husband. The echo chamber was an assault on the senses. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, hot metal, and recycled oxygen that had passed through too many lungs. The silence of the void was replaced by a constant, low thrum of life, the clang of hammers on hull plates, the murmur of 100 different conversations in a dozen different dialects, the distant, distorted wail of a ballad played on a synthesized string instrument. Jax met her at the airlock. His face, which she now saw for the first time without the distortion of a comms screen, was a roadmap of a hard life, etched with scars and framed by a grizzled beard. His eyes, however, were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. "Welcome to the land of the lost," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Don't mind the noise. It's the sound of us refusing to die quietly." He led her through the winding, narrow corridors of the port. People stopped and stared. Word had already spread. The ghost of Ethel, the Blight, the woman who had silenced a choral relay, was here. They looked at her with a mixture of awe, fear, and a desperate, hungry hope. She was a myth made flesh, and they were all starving for a miracle. Jax took her to what passed for a command center, a large, open space built into the asteroid's core, dominated by a holographic projection of the surrounding star systems. The map was a mess of red icons, each one marking a coral vessel or installation, a rash of perfect, sterile order spreading through the galaxy. A small group was gathered around the map, the de facto leadership of the Echo Chamber. There was Lena, a former corporate security chief with cold, calculating eyes and a network of informants that stretched across the outer rim. There was Kale, a young, brilliant engineer who could coax life out of dead technology with little more than intuition and a plasma torch. And there was an old man they called the Archivist, who sat in a corner surrounded by flickering data slates, his mind a living library of the Coral's movements, tactics, and, most importantly, their philosophy. "They're hunting you," Lena said, her voice devoid of preamble. She pointed to a cluster of red icons moving in a tight, coordinated search pattern, emanating from the system where Relay 734 had once been. "They're not just sending purifiers anymore. They've deployed a harmonizer, a big one, the Canonical of Stars." The archivist looked up from his slates, his ancient eyes fixing on Aris. "They are not hunting a ship," he said, his voice a dry whisper. "They are hunting a thought, an idea. The concept of a biological weapon is an existential paradox to them. They cannot harmonize it. They must erase the very possibility of it." Aris felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The Canticle of Stars was a legend, one of the Coral's great cathedrals of assimilation, a vessel capable of harmonizing an entire planet in a single cycle. It was an instrument of planetary-scale genocide, and it was looking for her. "They know you're biological," Kale added, his fingers dancing across a console, bringing up a stream of intercepted coral data, the sample they recovered from the asteroid. They've analyzed it. They're developing what they call a resonant purification field, a frequency that will destabilize and neutralize the cellular structure of your fungus on a quantum level. It's an antibiotic. Once they broadcast it from the Canticle, your blight becomes inert. Everywhere. Instantly. The room fell silent. Her weapon, her vengeance, her entire purpose had an expiration date, and it was approaching fast. "How long?" Aris asked, her voice steady. "Our best guess, 2 weeks." Kale said, "Maybe 3. They're moving the Canticle to the Helios Relay, the central hub for this entire quadrant. Once they're in position, they can broadcast the cure to every Coral ship and installation in 100 light-year radius. The war, for you, will be over." Aris looked at the map, at the red icon of the Canticle moving with serene, implacable purpose toward its destination. 2 weeks. All her years of pain and planning, all her rage and grief, reduced to a final, desperate deadline. "Then we have to stop them," she said. "We can't destroy the Canticle," Jax said, crossing his arms. "It's a fortress. Its crystalline hull is 1/2 kilometer thick, and it's escorted by a fleet of purifiers. It's a suicide run." "I'm not talking about destroying it," Aris replied, her eyes narrowing as an idea, a terrible, beautiful, insane idea, began to form in her mind. "I'm talking about infecting it." The room stared at her. "You heard Kyle," Lena said. "They're building a cure. Your fungus won't work." "My old fungus won't." Aris corrected. She turned to the archivist. You said they're hunting a thought, a biological weapon. They've studied my creation. They understand its structure, its function, how it attacks them. Yes, the old man whispered, his eyes widening with a dawning, horrified understanding. They have created an antibody designed to target its specific genetic signature. Exactly, Eris said, a grim smile touching her lips for the first time. They've built a lock. I'm going to build them a key. Her plan was audacious, a gamble on a scale that made her previous attacks seem like pinpricks. She wouldn't try to create a new fungus to attack the canicle. She would do the opposite. She would create a fungus that the coral's purification field would not only fail to destroy, but would actively, eagerly welcome. It was a Trojan horse, written in the language of genetics. Working in the echo chamber's surprisingly well-equipped but chaotic biolab, with Kyle as her assistant, Eris began the most complex and dangerous work of her life. She took the genetic code of her Thanatos strain and began to edit it. She didn't try to hide it from the coral's impending cure. She embraced it. She reverse-engineered the principles of their resonant purification field based on the fragmented data Kyle had managed to intercept. She isolated the specific gene sequences in her fungus that the coral's cure was designed to target. Then, she turned those sequences into a key. She recoded the fungus so that when the purification field hit it, it wouldn't be destroyed. Instead, the energy from the field itself would act as a catalyst, triggering a second dormant stage of the fungus's life cycle. It was a genetic switch. The cure would become the trigger. This new strain, which she called Janus, wouldn't just eat the coral's crystalline structures. In its second stage, it would do something far worse. It would hijack their ability to grow. It would use their own resonant energy to replicate itself, turning the canticle not just into a tomb, but into a factory, a massive, spacefaring tumor that would endlessly produce the most virulent, weaponized version of her blight. She wasn't just killing the god, she was corrupting its soul and turning it into a devil. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless, caffeine-fueled work. The lab was her sanctuary and her crucible. Kyle, with his intuitive grasp of energy frequencies, was invaluable, helping her model and predict how the coral's field would interact with her modified genetic code. The entire echo chamber mobilized to support her. Scavengers were sent on dangerous runs to find the rare biological compounds she needed. Jax and Lena worked on a plan to get her close enough to the canicle to deliver her payload. They would use the entire fleet of the echo chamber, 24 small, fast, barely held together ships as a diversion. A fleet of fools to draw the attention of the Purifier escort. It was a plan with a horrifically high chance of failure and an almost certain cost in lives. One evening, exhausted and staring at a complex protein folding simulation, Aris felt a presence beside her. It was the archivist. He held out a steaming cup of some herbal brew. "The coral have a concept," he said, his voice soft. "They call it the Great Silence, the state of perfect order, the final universal harmony when all dissonance has been removed." Aris took the cup, her hands shaking slightly. "I know. They see it as a paradise," the old man continued. "But a paradox lies at the heart of their philosophy. To create their perfect, static silence, they must engage in the most dynamic and chaotic of all acts war. They must destroy to create. They must sing of peace while making worlds scream." He looked at the glowing sample of the Janus strain in its containment field. "You Doctor have become their paradox made manifest. You use the chaos of life to bring them silence, a different kind of silence, the silence of the grave. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly firm. They believe they are the shepherds of the universe's final song. It is a beautiful lie. The universe does not sing. It babbles. It argues. It weeps and it laughs. It is a beautiful, chaotic, glorious noise. Do not let them silence it. With those words, he left her alone with her work. The weight of his words settled upon her, not as a burden, but as a benediction. She was no longer just fighting for her own memories, for the ghost of Elias. She was fighting for the universe's right to be messy, to be imperfect, to be alive. She was fighting for the noise. 2 days before the canticle was scheduled to reach the Helios relay, the Janus strain was ready. It pulsed with a soft, golden light, a beautiful, living lie, waiting to be told. The fleet of fools was prepped, their pilots grim-faced and ready. Eris loaded the single precious sample into a specially shielded canister on the Stellacide. This time, there would be no coming back. She was delivering the payload herself. As she walked to her ship, Jack stopped her at the airlock. He didn't say good luck. He didn't say be safe. He simply handed her a small, worn data slate. It's the comms frequency for the network, he said. The other ghosts. When you're done, let them know. Let them know it's time to start making some noise. Eris took the slate, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them, a bond forged in the shared fire of loss and defiance. She was the blight, and he was the rust. Together, they were the slow, inexorable decay of a perfect, sterile empire. She sealed the cockpit of the Stellacide, and, with the ragged fleet of the echo chamber flanking her, she flew out into the dark, a bringer of plagues, a shepherd of chaos, ready to teach a god of harmony the true meaning of silence. The Helios relay was not a structure, it was a phenomenon, a stable, naturally occurring confluence of hyperspace lanes. It shimmered in the void like a wound in reality, a nexus of cosmic energy that the coral had tamed and turned into the central broadcasting tower for their song. At its heart, suspended in a pocket of absolute tranquility, was the Canticle of Stars. It was even more magnificent and terrifying than the legends described. It wasn't built of crystal, it seemed carved from a single, flawless diamond, its vast, like cathedral-like spires absorbing the light of the nearby stars and refracting it into a halo of serene, divine light. It was an icon of untouchable perfection. Surrounding it, in a formation of breathtaking geometric precision, were 24 purifiers, their matte white hulls a stark, sterile contrast to the vibrant chaos of the relay, the fleet of fools. The ragged band of ghosts from the echo chamber jumped into the system on the far side of the relay, a calculated, desperate gambit. Their arrival was an immediate and shocking insult to the coral's perfect order. They came in loud, broadcasting everything at once: rock ballads from old Earth, garbled political speeches from forgotten colonies, the frantic, screaming gibberish of 1,000 different commercial advertisements. It was a cacophony of human noise, a defiant, chaotic shout against the silent purity of the coral. The purifier escort reacted with cold, swift efficiency. Half of the fleet detached from their guard positions and moved to intercept the noise, their null fields extending to smother the chaotic human transmissions. This was the moment. The diversion. While the coral's immune system was distracted by a dozen gnats, the virus slipped through. The Stellacide, running on silent, its hull chilled to near absolute zero, hugged the edge of a turbulent gas stream within the relay, using the natural energy fluctuations to mask its approach. Eris's heart pounded a frantic, biological rhythm against the cold, sterile certainty of her mission. She was a single, living cell approaching the heart of a god, carrying a disease of her own making. As she drew closer, the song of the canticle washed over her ship, over her own mind. It wasn't just a frequency, it was a presence. It whispered of peace, of an end to struggle, of the sublime beauty of surrender. It showed her images of Ethel, not as it was, but as it could have been harmonized. Perfect, a world of silent, crystalline beauty where Elias stood beside her, his hand in hers, both of them part of the great, silent whole. There was no pain, no grief, no rage, just a profound, blissful calm. She gritted her teeth, the taste of blood sharp in her mouth as she bit her own lip. He was beautiful when he was messy. She whispered to the ghost in her cockpit, the words a mantra against the seductive, deadly lullaby. He was beautiful when he was alive. The spell broke. The illusion shattered against the hard, jagged edges of her memory. Her grief, the very thing the coral sought to erase, had become her shield. She lined up her attack run. The target wasn't the hull. That was impenetrable. It was a thermal exhaust port, a small, almost invisible vent that cycled the immense heat generated by the canticle's resonant core. It was a tiny, insignificant flaw in an otherwise perfect design, a place where the god had to exhale. She had one canister of the Janus strain. She had one shot. She fired the magnetic grappling hook, the line unspooling silently across the void. It clamped onto the edge of the exhaust port with a faint, metallic click that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the silent cockpit. Then, she opened the valve, venting the entire payload directly into the canticle's circulatory system. The golden, glowing culture was sucked into the vent, a single, beautiful lie delivered to the heart of truth. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The canticle continued to sing its song of peace. The purifiers continued their methodical, silent slaughter of the fleet of fools. Eris watched, her breath held, her mission complete, but her fate utterly uncertain. Then, a single purifier, one of those still guarding the canticle, turned. It had detected her. It had heard the click. It accelerated towards her, its null field already reaching out to silence her forever. It was too late to run, too late to hide. This was the end. Eris closed her eyes, a sudden, strange calm washing over her. She saw Elias's face, not frozen in crystal, but alive, smiling, his hands covered in the rich, dark soil of Ethel. She had delivered the memory of that soil to the heart of their sterile god. She had done enough. Then it began. A flicker, the serene, white-blue light of the canticle of stars wavered just for a second. The song faltered, a single, discordant note marring its perfect harmony. The purifier that was about to kill her suddenly stopped, its systems frozen in confusion as it received a contradictory order from its god. On the main holographic display in the Echo Chamber's command center, Kyle screamed. It's working. My God, it's working. The canticle pulsed, and then it broadcast the cure. A wave of pure resonant energy, the purification field, radiated out from the great ship. It washed over the stelliseed, and Aris felt a strange, tingling sensation, as if her very atoms were being vibrated. But instead of dying, the Janus strain, now flowing through the veins of the coral's most powerful vessel, awoke. The trigger had been pulled. The golden lie had been believed. The light of the canticle shifted from a serene blue to a sick, cancerous yellow gold. The song of peace and order became a monstrous, distorted parody of itself. A symphony played on broken instruments, a choir of the damned. The crystalline spires began to change, to grow. The perfect, geometric patterns warped, twisting into unnatural, organic shapes. The ship was becoming a tumor. It was becoming a garden. Her garden. The effect on the coral fleet was instantaneous and catastrophic. Their own god was screaming blasphemy. Their perfect song had become a weapon against them. The purifiers froze, their programming shattered by the ultimate paradox. They were receiving a command to sterilize a frequency that was coming from their own command vessel. It was a logic bomb that melted their crystalline minds. Some simply went inert, drifting lifelessly in the void. Others, their systems fried by the conflicting orders, turned on each other in a silent, spasmodic ballet of self-destruction. The battle, if it could even be called that, was over. The fleet of fools, battered and bruised, but largely intact, stopped their chaotic broadcasts and simply watched in stunned, silent awe as the canticle of stars slowly, horribly transformed. It was no longer a cathedral. It was a monstrous, pulsating hive, a living monument to the beautiful, terrible chaos of life. Eris opened her eyes. She was alive. Her ship was damaged but functional. She looked at the dying god she had created, at the wreckage of its fanatical army, and felt nothing. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not even relief. Just a vast, hollow emptiness. The rage that had fueled her for years had been spent. The blight had been planted. Her war was over. She remembered the data slate Jax had given her. With trembling fingers, she pulled it from her flight suit and plugged it into her comms console. She opened the network, the hidden channel of the other ghosts, the scattered embers of humanity's defiance. She keyed in a single, system-wide broadcast. Her voice, when it came out, was rough, tired, and stripped of all emotion. "This is Ethel," she said, the name no longer a weapon, but a statement of fact. "The song has ended. The silence is broken. It's time to make some noise." The message went out, a whisper of hope carried on the solar winds, and across the dark, forgotten corners of the sector. The ghosts began to answer. Eris Thorne did not return to the echo chamber. Her work was done. She pointed the scarred, weary nose of the stelliseed toward the outer rim, toward the unknown, uncharted stars. Some say she went searching for a new world to seed with the bioarchives of Ethel, a place to start a new garden. Others say she is still out there, a silent guardian, a reminder that you can never truly silence life, that even in the most perfect, sterile garden, a single, stubborn weed will always find a way to grow. The coral were not destroyed that day, but they were broken. Their perfect song was shattered, their faith in their own divine order irrevocably corrupted. They retreated, pulling back from human space, trying to understand the nature of the chaotic, biological god of vengeance that had been born in their midst. Humanity, emboldened and united by the story of the Blight, began to push back, to reclaim their lost worlds, their voices rising together in a messy, chaotic, beautiful chorus. The great silence was over. The noise had returned. And in the heart of the Helios relay, the corrupted Canicle, now a colossal or drifting monument of golden, fungal life, pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, a grotesque and defiant heartbeat in the endless quiet of the void. It was Eris's gift to the galaxy, a tomb that had become a cradle, a reminder of the terrible, beautiful power of a single, unanswered scream.